Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Simon Beatty from the Knowledge Transfer Network. I'm your host for today's webinar. I see the room's filling up. Hopefully you can see on the screen now some protocol instructions for you. As it says, a large number of people are registered. That's nearly 200 people. Quite that many people haven't made it in yet, so I shall go through the protocol slowly, and hopefully they'll join us as we go. Again, hopefully you can hear me. If you can't hear me, you'll have a chat box on your display, probably either at the top of the screen or the bottom of the screen. Any issues on there, please just type the question in there. My colleague Poonam will be beavering away in the background, and she'll hopefully get you up online and be able to hear what's going on. As we go through the day, obviously you'll have some questions. We've got two ways that we'll be doing those questions, and if you submit them through the Q&A box, that'd be great. That just gives us the idea of technical issues and questions relating to the webinar today. Those questions may be answered almost straight away, and some others will be kept for the Q&A session, which is later on in the day. As I say, it's hosted by the Knowledge Transfer Network. We are the network providers for Innovate UK, who run this mission, and we're here to help people connect and innovate in these areas. As I say, Simon Beatty, the host, there's my email down there, and also joined us to the helpers in the background on the questions of Kaylee Johnson from the Agrifood team, which I work in myself as well, and Sandeep Sadhu from our international team. We do have one other helper in the background, a gentleman called Chris Danks, who used to work for the KTN and was on this mission. Chris recently left us and joined Innovate UK, but we brought him back in for that. So here we go. This is the overview and introduction from myself. I'm going to hand over to Peter shortly, who heads up the program, the missions programs with Innovate UK. He'll then pass us through the various speakers we have today. And then at around 10 to 3, we've got a chance to try and get some information from you. We're going to be using Mentimeter, so that's an online way of asking you some questions. So if you could be ready at some point to either open another tab or use your phone, etc., to get online, and we'll answer questions there. What would be really useful there is having that information. No doubt, as you go through today, get the excitement of working with other countries. There'll be questions around other future funding, which will be dealt with by the presenters later on today. But should that happen, we've got some evidence there that we can build cases and hopefully get things going in that way. And then finally, we'll come back to those questions that you submitted that we've kept to open on the forum for everybody here. So hopefully you're going to enjoy it. I know you haven't turned on to listen to me, and if you listen to these excellent speakers we've got. So I'm now going to hand over to Peter, who's going to talk you through the program overview. Peter, to you.
Great, thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much. Also, thanks to everybody for showing up at this webinar. It's really great to see such a good turnout today. So I'm Peter Durkin. As Simon says, I manage Innovate UK's missions program. I don't have any slides, so you just have to listen and watch me for 5 minutes. And I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes to explain what the missions program is all about, what expert missions are, and how they fit into the wider international activities by Innovate UK. So as you know, Innovate UK exists to help UK companies, make the best of new ideas and bring those new ideas from concept to commercialization. And of course, these businesses all are operating in a global marketplace. And of course, it then doesn't come as a surprise for you to hear that Innovate UK also has a series of international programs focused on specific aspects of innovation, depending on what UK companies need. And one of those programs is the missions program, and I'll explain a little bit what that means. Now, the first thing to say is that the missions program is not focused on trade. So we did not go out to Australia to sell UK products and services to the Australians, and neither were we interested necessarily, obviously, in terms of buying stuff from the Australians. The missions program, pretty much everything that Innovate UK does internationally, is ultimately focused on helping UK companies access the best of innovation overseas. So that is what the missions program is aimed at. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that we don't operate in isolation. We work very closely with other parts of government, which I'm sure as a taxpayer, you'll be very pleased to hear. So we work very closely with our colleagues in the Department for International Trade, both in the UK and overseas, in the embassies and high commissions, and in this case, very closely with our Australian colleagues and our Agri-Tech and satellite applications colleagues. Then there are also the Science and Innovation Network teams overseas. Clues in the name, they have an international remit in terms of science and innovation, and they're a very important team to work that we work with overseas as well. So that's the missions program, but it's divided into two big strands. On the one hand, we've got global expert missions, and that's what today's webinar is about, an expert mission in Agri-Tech to Australia. But on the other side of the program, there is a side of the program that's focused directly on providing opportunities, business opportunities to a selected group of companies. So expert missions are focused on scoping a particular opportunity. You can imagine, you know, the world is a big place, and Innovate UK needs to find out what the best opportunities are globally. So although we have some idea where the hotspots are, we have specifically designed expert missions to help us scope where those opportunities lie for UK companies in terms of helping them access the best of that innovation overseas. So expert missions have broadly three objectives. One is to build partnerships on behalf of UK government, but ultimately to help UK companies find partners overseas. They help us inform UK government and UK companies, and they also help us showcase UK strengths overseas. So typically we want answers to questions like, now, is there a business community for UK companies to partner with in the first place? How vibrant is that business community? What are its strengths and weaknesses? How vibrant is the innovation ecosystem in Agri-Tech in Australia in this case? What's the academic base? How strong is that? What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of that system compared to the UK? How does the funding work? How can Innovate UK find partners to connect to develop follow-on programs for UK companies? So those are typically the questions we want answers to when we design an expert mission. And as you will hear from my colleagues in the rest of the webinar, where we go in a lot more detail, each expert mission is typically a week's visit. This one I think might have been a little bit longer. But typically we take 6 to 8 experts, including our own experts, so Robert and others, and Callum and others overseas, to help us find answers to the questions I've just outlined. Now these experts give up their own time, and we pay their travel and subsistence. When they come back to the UK, they write a report of the findings, and Robert will go through the findings of this specific expert mission after my talk. And then we have a series of events, one of which is today's webinar, to make sure that we get the most of that investment, that public investment, if you like, to make sure that those findings are made available to as wide an audience as possible, both in terms of UK companies and government as well. Now the report and the findings might include a series of recommendations, or will include a series of recommendations, and might or might not include a recommendation to take a delegation of businesses to that specific market. So in this case, that's exactly what happened. We sent Robert and Callum and Carol overseas with a number of experts. And they recommended, amongst other recommendations, to follow the program up this year with sending a business delegation overseas. So we had a business delegation going out in February. And that's where I come to the other side of the program, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. So we're trying to make opportunities, create opportunities for UK companies. So on the one hand, you've got the expert missions, which are designed to do the scoping. We have another side of the program, which is directly focused on providing business opportunities to a delegation of businesses. So those programs are called Global Business Innovation Programs. And they are typically 9 to 12 months long, and they include a visit, in this case to Australia, but they're really divided into 3 main phases over that 9 to 12 month period. One is a recruitment and preparation of the companies. So we typically take 15 to 20 or 10 to 20 companies overseas. We prepare them, we help them make the best of that visit, and we have the visit, and then very importantly, when they come back to the UK, we follow them with an advisor. So we offer them a business advisor who can help them with a plan and who can help them exploit the opportunities that they've just identified. We help them identify during the visit, in this case to Australia. So the expert missions are run by our KTN colleagues. The EEN teams run our global business innovation programs. So that's the missions program in a nutshell. A very important program for Innovate UK. Focus on helping UK companies find the best and connect to the best of innovation overseas. On one hand, we've got scoping, expert missions run by our knowledge transfer network. And on the other hand, we have a side of the program called Global Business Innovation Programs, which are aimed at providing direct business opportunities to delegations of businesses. We typically run 10 expert missions and 10 GBIPs, as we call them, per year. And again, in very close collaboration with other parts of government. So that's kind of a very quick whistle-stop tour of our missions program. I hope that was helpful. I hope that gave you some insight into what we're trying to do. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. And I hand you over to Robert Crook, who's one of our innovation leads and who was part of this delegation. So he's the kind of technical expert on this particular global expert mission. Over to you, Robert.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Peter. So I'm Robert Crook. I'm Innovation Lead in Agriculture Engineering in the Agrifood group. I'm going to talk through the Agri-Tech bits of the GEM that we completed in Feb 2019. And then I'm going to hand over to Carol Sunderland, who's going to run through more detail on the satellite applications. So, as Peter described, who did we take and why did we go? We took a group of industry experts, so 5 people selected from industry, plus a number of people from Innovate UK and the KTN. People with specific skills, but also general skills in the whole agri-tech sector. We were supported by the Foreign Commonwealth Office Science Innovation Network. The aims were really to understand what was going on in Australia for the agri-tech landscape, to identify things that were complementary and things that we could learn from, and to actually meet people and build relationships with individuals and organisations. We wanted to evaluate, as Peter said, whether there was scope for further missions. And ultimately, as we work within the government, are there things we could do to communicate with the Australian government or the state governments to understand if we could reach agreements on agri-tech and research. So a bit about where do we go? Australia is obviously a very big country. Research said, we can't cover it all in the 5 days. It's typical for a GEM. So we chose to stay in the southeast corner. Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney. We wanted to meet with, I'd say, more institutional and research organisations, so from government, research, academic, science. We were interested in satellite applications, but we did also want to meet with some business people, understand what's going on. The other side was there was a new conference called EvokeAg. First conference was in 2019. It made sense to plan our trip around the week when EvokeAg was on. little bit more about where. Obviously, Australia is the other side of the world from where we are. And people are going, well, why did you go there? Obviously, Australia is important as itself. It's got a lot of agriculture going on. It's got a good innovation community, but it's also the surrounding region. So in Asia Pacific, we've got fast growing economies. We've got increasing populations. Those populations getting more wealthy. And what we learned in Australia is that they consider that to be their local markets. So, you know, around the Pacific Rim, you've got Indonesia and countries like this. And then obviously you've got the big populations in India and China. So Australia's great, but it's also a good footstep into that part of the world. Simple slide, simple story, just to understand the government landscape. Australia has two tiers of government. Firstly, the federal government, which is typically referred to or often referred to as the Commonwealth, which caused us some confusion for the first few days. And then Australia's got to 6 states, and each of the states has its own state government, typically referred to as a state. So just useful to know. Both federal government and state governments have the ability to, hold on, set their own policy legislation. So whilst Australia is one country, things can be different between the different states. So it's, you know, in our investigations, it was useful to understand where things start and where things finish. One of the important people or groups of people we met were the research organisations. There are many. I've picked out 4 of the what we consider to be the most important ones. So CSIRO at the top, Commonwealth, so it's funded by the federal government. It's a science and industrial research organisation. It works across all industry sectors. It has a medical research group. It has industrial research groups, but it has got agriculture and food as a key sector. It has funding, it has people, and it has research facilities. Second one, cooperative research centres. As it says, they're cooperative, so they're funded in between federal government and industry. They're not quite centres as in buildings and facilities and an empire. They're more of a thing that's set up to fix a specific industry problem or a specific country need. So it can be that they're set up and then they're closed down after they've done their work. But they, you know, there's a number of them. They exist in the Agri-Tech Centre. Examples are high performance soils, food agility, and SmartSat. Probably very important are the state government agricultural departments. Sometimes typically called departments of primary industry, but not always. They're responsible for running agriculture within the state. Again, they're setting policy and direction, but they actually have their own research farms, they have their own research facilities, and they have research people. So they're conducting research in their state, typically on the crops they're growing there. And then the last one, which I'll come back to, is a thing called Rural Research and Development Councils, or RDCs. I'll talk about those on a different slide. And Carol's going to talk through some of the things like Geoscience Australia and the Australian Space Agency. Universities, we met a number of universities. There's a well-established university network. Agriculture and the associated sciences are important in many universities. Again, they've got staff, research facilities, their own research farms, typically covering the farming sectors in their region. We also noted that science, engineering, technology are strong in Australia. Universities and the government are funding those. Research is a key part of university business. They're conducting research for industry, for the state, for the federal government. The universities are commercially minded. You know, they understand and protect their technology and their IP, and they understand the value of exploiting the IP. Many of the universities have got strong international links, and many of the people we met had links with UK universities, either because they'd done teaching in the UK or they were doing joint research with the UK. Okay, I mentioned earlier Rural Research and Development Councils, RDCs. These were one of the most interesting groups we met. There's, I think, 15 of them, and they represent all of the key agricultural sectors. So you can see in the top right there, you've got Dairy Australia, Wine Australia, MLA, Meat and Livestock Australia. Some of the smaller industries are represented by Agrifutures, things like equine production, I think honey was in there. So whilst Agrifutures represents a load of sectors, Agrifutures is also important because it has an overriding responsibility across the RDCs for things like irrigation, things that could influence or impact all of the other sectors. RDCs are levy funded, so the producers have a levy fund, and then they have match funding from the federal government. They have a lot of money. We were quite surprised. They have over 600 million Australian dollars to spend annually on R&D. And each of the RDCs will fund research, it will fund investigations to fix problems in their sector. They don't do the research is completed by universities, by research organizations, or even by industry. They'll pay a company to fix a problem. In addition to research and development, they have a role to look at market investigation and development. They're not cooperatives, they're not trading, they're not marketing. They're looking around the world to see where they could sell their products. And then they have a very big role in education and dissemination of information. Bottom right picture just shows the routing of funding into the RDCs and then across into all the research providers, and then at the bottom all the beneficiaries. I mentioned earlier EvokeAg. So this was a new event in 2019. It was based in the Royal Exhibition Hall in Melbourne, which is a pretty grand building and excellent venue. It's a 2-day international conference. Interests are Australia, then out to Asia Pacific, and then a global focus. It's probably high level, it's looking at agriculture, it's looking at agribusiness, it's looking at the food industry, but there's a strong element on Agri-Tech Innovation and on investment. They called it Startup Alley with, I think, 12 companies that were pitching their products, and there was an excellent opportunity for networking. The interesting thing at EvokeAg was a number of, I'll call them our competitors or potential collaborators. Obviously New Zealand is close to Australia, but there were representatives there from Israel, United States and Europe. So it's interesting that if they're all in Australia, then maybe we should be in Australia. A bit about Australian agriculture. It's not all hot, dry and dusty, which is what I think some of us thought before we went. They've got a wide range of climates. They've got all the conditions. We learned that Australia grows virtually every crop type and every livestock type. Australia is self-sufficient in virtually all food products and all commodity groups. They've got a strong agriculture. They export 2/3 of their agricultural produce by value. Talking to some farmers and people, the story was agriculture's tough in Australia. There's no support mechanisms. They have dramatic changes of climate and extremes of climate. Water and climate change are going to be a real challenge. We also learned that, obviously Australia's a big country, farms are large areas, the distances are huge, and they're in remote locations, so communications can be difficult. What we also learned is that Australia could be really good for innovators and companies. There's alternative crops that we're not growing, there's conditions that we don't have in the UK, and of course, because the seasons are opposed, you can get 2 seasons in 1 year. Again, agriculture is important to Australia. Whilst we were at EvokeAg, the Australian government launched an initiative called Agriculture 4.0. They've stated they want to grow agricultural production from 60 billion Australian dollars to 100 billion by 2030. So that's in 10 years. They want to increase their exports, and they recognise that the Pacific region, as I mentioned before, is growing, it's getting wealthier. There's a strong demand for high value, high quality foods, and traceability and provenance is important because there's been food scares in China and other countries. Simple slogan, Eat Australia, was something we picked up. Australia has all the same challenges of global agriculture, same as in the UK. Increased production, productivity. I'm not going to read them all, but it's the same things: production, profitability, sustainability, manager inputs, quality and traceability. Workforce is mentioned because labour's getting older in Australia and the availability of labour is getting smaller. They need to accommodate climate change, and obviously water is a big deal. The government recognised Agri-Tech as a key input to achieving these goals, and they also recognise that Australia can't do it by itself, that they've got good innovative countries and companies, but they need more to help them. So, as Peter mentioned, normally if we do a GEM and it was successful and we learnt good things, the follow-up is a GBIP, Global Business Innovation Programme. So the good news is we had positive reports from our GEM in 2019, so we chose to complete a GBIP in 2020. So we ran a competition, identified 12 UK startup companies, and we created a mission again to Australia. We chose to go to a VOCAG again because we were so impressed in 2019. But this time we sort of got out of the cities and went into the countryside a bit. So we went to Armadale, Wagga, Orange, which are more rural communities. And the focus this time was more to meet with companies, some farms. In the GEM, we discovered there's a reasonable incubator and accelerator hub network. So we visited those. And obviously we met the research organizations, universities. But the aim was to go to these places and meet people and meet actual innovators and make contacts that could be useful for our companies and for those. So just some final thoughts. There's definitely interest, potential and capability in agri-tech in Australia. As Peter said earlier, collaboration is important. We're looking to collaborate, give and take, and not just to take. We don't want to trade and give all of our ideas away. There's many similar challenges in Australia, but there's obviously new applications and new developments because of the climate and the crops. And of course, you've got the alternate seasons, which give you another opportunity. I think access to the Asia Pacific region is really useful and a benefit of being in Australia. And like I said, we saw New Zealand, Israel, USA and others working in Australia already. So if we get there, there's an opportunity to work with those people. There's a strong incubator and accelerator hub network. Probably a negative is that we picked up while we were there, investment is always a challenge for startup companies. At VOCAG, there were certainly companies from North America in the investment community present, but it's the same story as innovators in the UK, that trying to get your investment to keep your company and your product moving is always a challenge. So we did the GEM, we did the GBIP, so that's great. Another step would be to start looking at, whether we can work between the UK government and Australian state or federal governments. So that's something that we're talking about at the moment, but obviously with COVID-19, it's not the highest priority. Last thing we learned on the right, that Australians are pretty blunt. So what we did learn is if you ask a direct question, you get a direct answer. And these are just some quotes that I picked up from people. Either at the innovation hubs or the RDCs. I think the middle one's probably the best. This was from one of the RDCs who said they would invest money, basically they'd invest money anywhere that would fix a problem for their growers and make them money. So I think that's my part of the presentation complete, and I'm going to hand over to Carol, who's going to continue talking through the satellite applications. Stop sharing. Turn me off.
Thanks, Robert. Hello, everyone. I'm going to speak briefly about our findings from the trip in 2019 in relation to satellite applications. So, why did we have some focus on satellite applications? Well, both the agriculture sector and Australia present good opportunities for satellite application development. And this is in terms of communication, positioning, navigation and timing, as well as Earth observation. Satellite-enabled capabilities can already help address a number of challenges within the agriculture sector, and particularly precision farming. And they are likely to offer increasing value with ongoing advances in satellite technology, ground terminals, analytics, data integration, and the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. There is also increasing potential for the uptake with the greater use of wider digital technologies in the agriculture sector. And in terms of Australia, the vast and remote landmass is really well aligned for solution development and testing. In addition, the Australian federal government, as well as some of the state governments, are placing a great deal of importance with both digital agriculture and the space sector. Australia is investing in its own developments in these areas, and this indicates the potential for some relevant and interesting collaborative R&D. On the subsequent industry trip in February this year, 8 out of the 12 UK companies were using or intended to use satellite technology as part of their offerings, and these included some exciting developments. As Robert mentioned, most of our meetings on the 2019 trip were with government organisations and universities, and this gave us insight into some of the priority areas for Australian R&D. So I'll speak briefly about a few findings for the 3 separate satellite capability types, but please do note that these findings were from 2019, so it is possible that some of the priorities might have changed a little since then. So firstly, Earth observation. There are some broad goals and priorities for Australian agriculture that are relevant to Earth observation development. These include increasing productivity, increasing input efficiencies, combining sensors and software for crop and pasture management. And a number of Australia's agricultural rural research development corporations also mentioned some relevant requirements for their respective sectors. So for example, Agri-Futures, they expressed the need for the management of mass crop production, particularly rice, and the development of prediction models. And Dairy Australia expressed the need for near real-time information, particularly in relation to pasture quality and growth monitoring, measurement and prediction to support decision-making. They specifically mentioned interest in smarter feeding projects and an interest in more development projects in this area. So there are companies from both the UK and Australia progressing developments in these areas. And one example includes Hummingbird Technologies, and this is a high-growth precision farming company that's already providing successful remote sensing solutions, and that includes applying both satellite and drone data together with AI techniques. They were founded in the UK and successfully expanding operations in Australia. In addition then, the Australian federal government are investing in national data platforms, and they're also showing a commitment to stimulating the use of EO data. So one such platform is Digital Earth Australia, and this is developed by Geoscience Australia as part of the Open Data Cube initiative. This is intended to raise the baseline of usable free Earth observation data and improve its ease of use, particularly in the agriculture and environmental sectors. The plan is to also grow the ecosystem with industry and enable the growth of value-adding geospatial services. It's an interesting development, and it will be equally interesting to see how this platform will enable industry, particularly SMEs, to develop long-term sustainable value-adding services. One of the UK SMEs on the industry trip this year has indicated that they expect to find the platform useful. Incidentally, there'll be an online public showcase of the platform on May the 21st. So if you do want to hear more about it, it'll be live at about 4 o'clock in the morning for us. So if you're really dedicated, you can tune in then. But it might also be possible to access some follow-up information. Another platform is the Digiscape Future Science platform, and this is developed by the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, also known as CSIRO. This is a common big data infrastructure that uses both local and remotely sourced federated data. And this is also for the agriculture and environmental sectors. And again, I'll be interested to see how this develops for industry to provide value-adding services. And now for satellite communication opportunities. So Australia continues to experience challenges with rural communication coverage. And so there are fundamental requirements for affordable, reliable connectivity in remote areas. And there is also interest in greater interconnectivity, including developments for agricultural asset and livestock tracking. So this presents opportunities for the development and testing of satellite communication systems in general, and including integrated hybrid receiver devices and satellite-enabled IoT systems. Again, there are companies from both the UK and Australia with developments in this area. An Australian example this time is Miriota, and they've just secured 28 million Australian dollars in terms of private investment from a Series B funding round. So in terms of position, navigation and timing, there's an ongoing interest in increased positioning accuracy in Australia. And this could provide greater precision for in-field guidance and also be quite pivotal in the uptake of autonomous farm vehicles. So it was interesting to hear that Australia and New Zealand are collaborating on the development of a satellite-based augmentation system for a southern positioning augmentation network. This activity is led by Geoscience Australia, and it capitalises on the geographical advantage of having high visibility to 6 global navigation satellite systems. Once operational, the positioning accuracy is expected to be within 10 centimetres remotely and 3 to 4 centimetres where there is mobile phone coverage. And I think it's anticipated to be operational by 2023. So I'll now just sum up with a few relevant alliances and initiatives that are happening at the moment. In September last year, it was announced that the UK and Australia had agreed to work in partnership to create a space bridge. And this represents a mutual endeavour to bring about greater ongoing collaboration between the 2 countries in the space sector. This is being led by the UK Space Agency and the Australian Space Agency, and together with the respective trade organisations DIT and Austrade, and work is going on at the moment for the framework. So this is in development, and the intention, I think, is for this to be in place by the summer of this year. This also involves a partnership between the UK's Satellite Applications Catapult and the Australian SmartSat Cooperative Research Centre. And now these 2 organisations also have a partnership as part of the Space Bridge and also independently of the Space Bridge. And together they're exploring various industry opportunities. Agriculture, for instance, is intended to be a primary downstream sector for the Space Bridge initiative. So if you're interested in this, please do expect to hear more in the coming few months. And if you're also interested in further discussions with the Satellite Applications Catapult, they will also be interested to hear from you. So there's also an ongoing relationship between the Satellite Applications Catapult and CSIRO and Geoscience Australia on a range of activities, and including the Open Data Cube. And then thirdly, there's a strategic partnership between the UK Space Agency and CSIRO through the International Partnership Programme. And that was to, or is, I should say, to develop an all-weather decision support system for Pacific small island developing states. Well, this concludes my section, so please feel free to contact me if you'd like to discuss anything further. And I'd now like to hand over to Freddie Reid, who also participated in the 2019 trip, and he'll speak about his experience as a delegate. Thank you.
Hi guys, can you hear me? Right, I'm just, wait a second. There we go. So, hi there, I am Freddie Reid and I'm Projects and Technical Manager at the Agri-Epi Centre. So the Agri-Epi Centre is one of the 4 Agri-Tech Innovation Centres set up by the UK government and funded through Innovate UK as part of their Agri-Tech strategy. And our purpose is to drive the growth of the UK Agri-Tech sector. So I was a delegate on the 2019 trip, and I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about my impressions of the trip, how we talked about going about collaborating with Australia throughout the trip, and some interesting organizations that we found during the trip. So in terms of the impressions of the Australian agri-tech space, they have very largely similar problems in terms of agri-tech uptake and stage of development of agri-tech. So there's the barriers and drivers to the uptake of agri-tech are very, very similar to the UK. These include bad connectivity, the initial setup costs of the technology are too high, and there isn't a perceived benefit quite yet. So these are very largely similar to the problems we have in the UK. In terms of working with the Australians, they have a very similar business culture and obviously strong cultural links with the country. And we have very strong links between our country's ag sectors. So lots of students, when they leave RAU or Harper Adams or SRUC, will go over to Australia and work a season over there, and vice versa. Also, along with that, lots of the universities we went to, professors and researchers there had worked for a stint in the UK as well. Found throughout the trip that they had a very strong interest in international collaboration, especially with the RDCs, that if there's a technology out there in the world that solves a problem in their sector, they're happy to go out and get it from abroad rather than develop it in-house at home. So in terms of collaborations with the Australian agri-tech sector, it was an interesting fact, Robert touched on it slightly earlier, in terms of investment into agri-tech companies. So in the UK and Australia, agri-tech is slow to attract VC funding at the moment. So this was back in 2019. It's seen a bit of an uptick since then, but this is largely due to the inability to scale at the pace that a VC needs to have a company that actually can scale globally quickly. So this is due, in the UK, you have completely different conditions and problems in Aberdeenshire to what you have in East Anglia. And if you think about Australia, from Darwin down to Melbourne, the complete difference in agricultural conditions you get throughout the country is absolutely huge. But it also presents an opportunity for both nations, in that we need to make an ecosystem where it's easier for UK companies to go and work in Australia and Australian companies to go and work in the UK. And that is something that we were really interested in on the trip. In terms of collaborating with Australia, from our perspective, working with the states or the RDCs would be an easier win in the short term, as they're a bit more quicker foot, and they can access funds a bit quicker. So they also have their own initiatives set up specifically for agri-tech, especially at the state level, where we met with a number of different organisations such as the GATE of New South Wales, which is an agri-tech accelerator programme, and other similar ones. And RDCs also have their own agri-tech specific initiatives going on. In terms of the Innovate UK perspective, a deeper relationship would come with a federal collaboration, but this would obviously have a longer lead time to organise. So in terms of Agri-Epi, we had a couple of follow-ups from the trip with interesting organisations that we met out there. I work at Agri-Epi specifically with the Satellite Farm Network, which is our network of 24 commercial farm businesses, which we've set up as testbeds for research and development to bring agri-tech research closer to the industry. So this is an area I'm quite interested in. And these two organisations listed here, the Bridge Hub and the University of New England Smart Farm Network, were a similar concept operating over there in New Zealand, in Australia. So the Bridge Hub is a life cycle innovation hub for the Australian agri-food tech industry. And one of their big focuses is creating international bridges to other countries so that you can have that cross collaboration with agri-tech startups from over the world. Their first bridge they have created is to Israel, and they were largely responsible for the Israeli influence at the Evoke Ag conference and on the wider Oz agri-tech scene. They have very similar raison d'etre to us, which is to bring together the pillars of industry, research and government. And they also work with commercial farmers providing test beds in Australian agriculture for development of new technologies over there. Then we also, another interesting organization we met with was the University of New England Smart Farm Network. So this is made up of 8 properties covering 3,820 hectares. They weren't commercial farms, they are university research farms. But they support a wide range of different disciplines, from arable, dairy, pigs, poultry, I think goats and things like that as well. And they have a large connected landscape of sensors, which allows them to capture data and record transferable data from the different properties, which can be used on research. So these are some interesting organizations that are providing some access to the boots on the ground agriculture in Australia, which we met with out there. So yeah, all in all, it was a very, very interesting trip, a very busy trip. We covered a lot in the 5 or 6 days we were out there, but very insightful, and I think we all came away with an excited feeling that Australia would be an exciting place to collaborate with. So I'm now going to pass over to Sam Host, who is next up.
Thank you very much, Freddie, and everybody else. Thank you. So I was an industry participant on the mission in 2019. My background is in genetics, but also as in agri-tech startups. Since then, I have also joined as part-time the Department of International Trade, where I'm one of the animal science specialists in that team. So I will do 2 parts during this talk. I will talk a little bit about my experiences from the visit in 2019 and where we are at the moment in terms of discussions. So there's been quite a bit of talk about the Evoke meeting, and the facilities and the rooms and things that were there made that an absolutely superb conference in terms of the visuals and facilitation of panel discussions and the whole conduct of that meeting. I've not been to anything as well run as that before or after. And it was also exceedingly good in terms of that, as Robert had said, it had brought together a large number of players from across the world who were interested in agriculture and agri-tech, and the venue provided incredible networking and socializing facilities over the 2 days that the event was on. And I would, if people were wanting to enter Australia, I think it is a very good event to focus around and do other things around it if you're interested in that. And Australia as a destination, I think we've covered quite a number of these, but I think we have one of the things that came across in the Evoke conference was the story, the narrative that the Israelis and other countries were putting together, and I think we can do the same. I think we've got an enormous amount going on in the UK. We just need to be better at our story in terms of putting that across, and I think we can do that. Entering and learning about what's going on in Australia should be relatively easy in terms of culture and language. And this thing about having multiple climates within one country does enable us to be able to, certainly on the crop side, growing crops in multiple climatic conditions within one management system, if you like, within the country, within Australia. But it also enables us to be able to flipping things from growing things in the northern hemisphere and also in the southern hemisphere. So there's some good advantages in terms of in location in terms of Australia. I think there's a lot, and again, Robert has talked about the export of nature of Australia, and I think it's also a very good place to actually go and learn about how they do exports, because they've got that market there, and a lot of what is produced in Australia goes to Southeast Asia. It's worth going to find out how that is done, and that's something we could focus on more next time. One thing that we haven't mentioned so far, I think, the learning that goes on between the participants in a sort of trip like what we had in 2019 and I'm sure in 2020, there is an enormous amount of learning goes on, and potentially trade afterwards and things with the people who are on those missions. So I would encourage it just on that basis, never mind anything else. There are obviously some challenges, and depending what companies are trying to do from the UK, but obviously it's a long way from the UK. There's a time difference that if you're also trying to trade with or work with colleagues in America and things, that becomes difficult. And the consumer market is relatively small, so there is an absolute export focus which people need to be aware of. So in terms of now moving to wearing my DIT hat more, Department of International Trade, there was obviously the mission that occurred earlier this year where 12 companies went across. And I will build on that. I suppose it's the program that goes around the Evoke conference that really brings these things together. That there's a whole suite of things and visits that were made that makes it a very useful program. And I suppose it's also doing this over a number of years, I think, brings increasing credibility to what we're doing. So in terms of on the trade side, where we're going to repeat trade shows, that the confidence and reliability and credibility that we get from that is quite tangible. So in terms of saying the next time that the Evoke conference is on is the 15th to 17th of February 2021 over in Perth, so the other side of the country. At the moment, I can't say what there will be in terms of funding, etc. But DIT, Innovate UK and the KTN have all been talking about this and are keen to go there, assuming we can. So one of the things that is possible is to start feeding in ideas about what you would want as a business from such a visit. So it's going to be in Western Australia, in terms of the crops that are possibly grown there, the livestock side of things. There's an even more focus on the export than there is in other parts of Australia. And as Robert has said, there's a possibility to meet producers, processors, which is really useful for agri-tech startups in terms of understanding the customers. Again, reiterating what Robert said earlier, the Australian levy boards are really a useful contact, and they do put out tenders for work and things. So there are examples of UK companies that are actually doing work with Australian levy boards. So there's a good opportunity there. And the ecosystem in terms of incubators and accelerators is increasing in Australia, and in Perth there's one called AgriStart. But there's a good university base as well around Perth in terms of Murdoch University, and certainly on the livestock side they've got a very significant veterinary science and life sciences department there that is already a lot of interest and a lot of collaboration between the UK and Australia. So please feed in going forwards in terms of how we can make that programme around a visit to Evoke beneficial to your business. What do you want to go and see? What do you want to visit? And hopefully we can, at this early stage, feed that into what that programme looks like around a visit to Evoke next year. So that's that. In terms of where the Department of International Trade fit in, there's an Agri-Tech team in the UK that can help you with events and visits, and also contacts, and I have replied to somebody on this call. We can put you in contact with the people in embassies overseas in terms of finding partners. There is some financial support to attending trade missions through the Trade Access Partnership Scheme, and we can support inward visits from people coming from overseas coming to the UK. But I think one of the biggest things that is probably forgotten is that we have posts throughout the world who can actually help companies in terms of identifying export opportunities in different locations. We can support inward and outward trade missions. At key events, the people can help you host stands there. And obviously there's contacts between local governments and associations. We can provide overseas market intelligence reports, and we do work with DEFRA in terms of market access issues. So that's me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening. And my contact details and the general one for the DIT Agri-Tech team is there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to all the speakers for taking the time to do that and explain everything to people about the missions and what's happened so far. Hopefully then you've all found that of use. The questions did start to come in. Don't forget that you can keep putting those questions into the Q&A box whilst we do that, and my colleagues in the background will be answering some of those and selecting some of those for the Q&A panel that's coming up shortly. What we want to do now is try and get you to help us build any cases, give us more ideas that Sam was talking about, and I can see some of you without my instructions have started to get onto that. So if you get a smartphone out or open another tab, go to menti.com. It will then prompt you with a question of what the code is. Obviously the code on this is 284066, and we're starting to see people come through now with that fairly basic question, are you already working with Australia? If you're having any troubles getting onto that, again, just use that chat box and somebody should be able to help you, but it should be relatively simple as say onto another device, menti.com, and the code 284066. So this is looking quite interesting. We've got, I was going to say, a fairly even split with yeses and nos. We did have this last week, so you may have been with us doing the New Zealand one. The New Zealand one was slightly different, well, it was a very different balance. So it's good to see that there are differences between the two markets. And we'll just give that a few more moments to work through and see if we get any more responses in there as people work it up. Again, if you're one of those quick ones who got your answers in and you have got a question for our speakers, remember there's that Q&A box that we're working on in the background. So it has leveled up again, so it looks quite even. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move us on to the next question. So those people, whether you're working out, are you importing or exporting innovations? Or are you actually doing both? That's the question. And what we'll see on this as the answers come in is a split. So that split will depend on how you answered that first question. So again, it'll just give us a little bit more information. Now, I think I've misled you on that. This is just a straightforward question. But again, it looks like you're really getting the hang of it now as we're rattling up to 30 odd entrants. Just for interest of those, I don't think when you're on the webinar, you get to see this, but I think we peaked around 110 people on this webinar. So you can tell there is some interest there. And I think we're around 40 on that first question. So exporting is just about the main, with actually neither is, isn't it? But let's see how that builds as we go on to the next question. So I'd like to think from attending today, there would be some interest to collaborating with Australia as we go piling that. Are we going to get any no's, I guess, is the question here. So don't just do that just to prove me wrong or anything. Obviously, we want the real answers, as I say. We do find engaging with you one makes a little bit of change from moving from listening mode to participating a little bit more in the webinar, but it also does help us build any cases and provide evidence of anything that people want to do moving forward. Okay, so we know you want to do it. So which sectors? Is that crop? Is it in livestock, automation? Obviously the satellite applications that Carol talked to you about, or other? This is one that always intrigues me because we stick other in just to make sure we don't miss anything, but we can never quite capture what that other is. So if you have stuck other in there and that you think it's a very important area, perhaps you could just either put that in the chat box or in the Q&A box and give us that opportunity to build that into anything that we use going forwards. So at the moment, just look, crops just slightly ahead, but there's not much in it. And I think as Carol pointed out in her presentation, there was a lot of interest around satellite applications. I wish I'd kept the New Zealand ones open in front of me now, but I think we've certainly got a higher take up on this one. And as we go on with this, obviously there's the other people on the panel. If you have any thoughts, comments, or anything, feel free to unmute yourself and chip in so people get to listen to somebody else and not just me droning on. Okay, we've got some good and very even split really there, but I'm going to move on to our next question now. So the barriers to collaboration, this is free for text. You can put multiple answers in, and as you answer, almost like a post-it note will come here. Funding, we're really expecting that. We're expecting quite a few funding ones. So if you could think about anything else that's going to stop you, is it that time barrier that Sam was talking about towards the end? I don't know, is it anything to do with I think Robert was saying about how there's lots of different climates in Australia. Does that make a difference to you, or does that make it more attractive? Here we go. The partnering one's a good one. Obviously, you've heard from Peter to start off with the whole system around there, with EEN, KTN to some extent, and obviously we've had Sam with his DIT hat on. And I think that probably, if you want to find that correct collaboration, perhaps you want to pick up with Sam and have a discussion around the evoke bit. Of course, on any of these, if after today you've still got some thoughts and minds towards the end, we've got a closing slide with contact details of the KTN and the Innovate UK people on board. Drop us an email and we'll do our best to either connect you to the speaker, answer that question for you, etc. So there's a lot coming in here. IP questions, that's an interesting one. I often expect IP questions to come up with countries like China, but it's good to know that it's applicable to other markets. Lack of connection between different state governments, compartmentalization of funding between those. Very interesting stuff, really. Again, we're up against it on time. We do try to cover as much as possible. So we'd ask you the next question of, what would help you overcome these barriers? I'm going to put money on the fact that funding is going to come up again, but let's just see how you react to that one. Has anyone from the panel got any thoughts or anything jumped up from what they've seen so far? Person on the ground, that's an interesting one. Again, I'll just go back to Sam, who was talking about the networks they've got. So that would be the science innovation networks. They're very good people to do. You do get things, sometimes you have to pay for those basic reports, but they are very good reports from experts who are in the country and can help with that. So again, that point from Sam of evoke attendance looks good. Return visits by Australian delegates. I don't think there's been any reciprocal visits. Does anybody on the panel know anything different to that?
Hi, Simon, it's Robert here. No, I'm not aware of that. I mean, on the call we had in New Zealand last week, obviously New Zealand's got the Callaghan organisation that funds innovation and plans trips to the UK, but one of the things we didn't find is a Callaghan organisation in Australia that's actually working directly with innovators.
I think that's a big distinction actually between New Zealand and Australia. Australia, it felt like it was split up amongst the states, whereas New Zealand had an overarching Innovate UK equivalent across the whole of New Zealand. That was quite a big distinction we noticed between the two countries.
Okay, it's always good to know how different countries work. So that's very useful. Thank you for that, Carol. So, how do you perceive the comparative strengths of the Australian agri-tech sector? Let's see if we can get a nice little word map up here and see what those big strengths are that you see as people on today. Scale, yeah. Kind of think, yeah, it is a big old place. It's a very big scale now.
Yeah, it's probably also worth saying, so Peter Durkin here again, I mean, there's quite a few questions about funding and sort of follow-on activities. Just because there isn't any specific program at the moment that provides funding for UK, Australia innovation partnerships, that doesn't mean that there won't be any in the future. There's definitely a focus for Innovate UK for the future. As we said before, there isn't the logical, straightforward candidate in terms of a partnership organization we can work with. Australia is obviously a much bigger country than New Zealand, and a different history, and it's a different political structure with individual states making up a commonwealth, a federal structure. We're exploring all those opportunities both on a federal level and a state level. So watch this space, I would say. Yeah,
thank you. That, and I'd kind of look at that from the experience we have on a KTN and general funding competitions. It's the people that are already working together and have got some projects, I wouldn't say ready to go, but have those relationships already built that often have the stronger project proposals. So I'd always encourage people to do the hard work now. Sorry. Go on, Robert.
I think that, say, one of the most interesting groups we met were the RDCs, and whilst they are funding research through universities or research organisations, they will certainly work with individuals, with startups, and with companies. We were given an example at one of the hubs where they'd actually identified a startup company that had something that was fairly close to what they were trying to fix. So rather than doing the research, they actually went and funded that company to adopt their product to make it work in their application. And they're all totally open organisations. They fund through open competitions, and they've all got a website, and you can go on there and see what they're funding and what their areas of interest are.
Great, thank you, Robert. So I think I've moved on to the final question, which is, what have we in the UK agri-tech sector got that we can bring to those collaborations? So it's great to see people are thinking about this already. And as I say, some of the introductions, etc., things that we can pick up after today. And I always recognise the fact that funding is key to people.
So it's Carol here, just to add on the funding subject. We do expect to hear about some funding in regard to the Space Bridge initiative, and that, as I say, is being led by the UK Space Agency and DIT on the UK side. But we do think there will be an agreement and some funding coming through for that, certainly this year. I don't know the exact time frame, but certainly worth keeping an eye out in the next few months to hear the progress of that. And that's purely, obviously, in relation to satellite applications for agriculture.
Sure. Thanks for that, Carol. So I know the KTN have a number of newsletters, and I presume that we would pick it up and be able to disseminate that. So if people wanted to join the KTN newsletters, that's one way of doing it. Are there any other mechanisms for people to follow that potential, well, that funding as it comes through and be notified?
Yes, well, it'll be made known by the UK Space Agency, and I suspect, well, also DIT. We will also make sure we announce that as soon as we hear about it, and we'll liaise with you as well at the KTN. So we'll use as many channels as we can to get the message out.
Excellent, thank you for that, Carol. So that was the final slide in that, which just brings us now on to the question and answers for the speakers. We've had your questions. Thank you very much for submitting those. And I believe the order that my colleagues are going to ask those questions to the panel is Sandeep first, then Chris, then Kaylee. Does that sound right to you, Sandeep?
Yes, that's right. So my first question was actually on funding. But I think we've kind of touched upon that, unless anyone from the panel wants to add anything further. But in addition to funding, someone asked about if funding isn't available, are there other ways that UK businesses can work with Australian universities or businesses or their counterparts to develop technologies appropriate to global farms, and who would the contact be to explore local funding opportunities? And I would just expand on the Science and Innovation Network. They would be perhaps the first point of call for understanding the local funding opportunities, but I'll hand over to the panel in case they want to add anything there.
Is there someone who wants to take that one from the panel?
Yeah, I think as Peter Durkin here, I think ordinarily you would approach our EEN team, your local EEN team, for those type of questions. They have links with equivalent organizations overseas. I think the Science and Innovation Network are probably not ideally placed to answer individual questions from individual companies, if I'm honest.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. So again, if anybody's got any difficulties with that, drop us an email and we'll find somebody for you. Sorry, Robert.
I think the other people we dealt with them is Austrade, which is an Australian trade organisation. And again, okay, they're perhaps more talking at government level, but they put us in touch with all the people we met. So they have local contacts in Agri-Tech who know the universities or the companies that are working in the different sectors.
Thank you. Should we move on to your question now, Chris?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, a question I think for Carol and Freddie, perhaps. Did you come across any relevant monitor farms for digital farming, and were there examples of Earth observation data and measuring natural capital at any of those monitor farms?
So this is Carol here. On the 2019 trip, we didn't visit any of those such farms. I'd be happy to explore this question a bit further if you'd like to, if we can be put in touch with the person asking the question. I don't know if Freddie has any further response on that.
So not on the natural capital side, but the University of New England Smart Farm Network were doing Earth observation, and then they also had in situ sensors over the farmland they were working with. So soil moisture, weather stations, things like that. But they also are working on environmental projects, but I'm not sure entirely on the natural capital side.
Thank you.
I could just add on the GBIP this year rather than the GEM. Yes, we went to University of New England Smart Farm, and that was quite impressive. The South Australia Department of Primary Industry, their Department of Agriculture has state farms, and they're investing in smart farm technology on their farms. And then obviously Australia's had had all of the wildfires going on in November, December. And we certainly picked up the message that they were using satellite sensing to understand the extent of the wildfire and the recovery.
Thanks, Chris. So Kaylee, have you got the next question, please?
Yep, I've got a question as well. So there was a
question posted in the Q&A box about whether on the mission there was any discussion of the potential of solar powered greenhouses or vertical farms, which I know is a priority in some cases in the UK. So anyone from the panel who might be able to speak to that would be welcome to.
I would say both on the GBIP and the GEM, on the vertical farming, it was mentioned, but I wouldn't say there was any stronger interest than in this country. It's definitely there and it's happening. There was some talk on solar power because obviously Australia currently relies on fossil fuels for a lot of its power generation. So I think there's going to be, they were all talking as if they're going to invest in solar power for power generation. And I guess that rolls into farming eventually.
And just to add also, at the Evoke conference, again on the 2019 trip, because I wasn't on the subsequent one, but so back last year at Evoke, there was a very interesting presentation about an innovation around the vertical farming concept. So that was something that was being considered in Australia, but also I think in some other countries such as Singapore and one or two other countries that had visited and were talking at the Evoke conference.
When we were out there as well, I believe there was a specific CDC funding call for vertical farming technologies. But that was obviously, back in February 2019, that was out.
Okay, thank you for that. So unless anyone else got anything they want to jump in on that, I'm going to invite Sandeep to come back with another question.
Hi there. Yeah, I've got another one. Were there any interesting insights into the agri-cooperatives and the use of Earth observation technologies? So I don't know if Carol might want to start on that question.
Sorry, yes, did you just repeat with respect to Earth observation, as to whether they're being used already, or is that the question?
Yeah, just the use of Earth observation technologies and whether the cooperatives were using them, or if we heard anything along those lines.
Yeah, so certainly, well, we heard quite a lot from the RDCs, that's the rural development corporations, and they were expressing not only an interest in Earth observation applications, but they were saying that they were being used, but they did see an opportunity for further development in some areas. So I think there's a bit of a mixture there where there is some use of Earth observation application, and there's real interest, I think, in seeing how that can be developed and how there are still some challenges. I noticed that some of the RDCs were saying that they saw some challenges around still the problems with clouds, etc. So they're looking really to see how these can be overcome and see what the further developments are as well.
Thank you. Chris, have you got another question?
Yeah, we've got a question, quite a broad one. With upcoming free trade agreement negotiations with Australia, are there any opportunities within FTAs to promote agri-tech cooperation between the UK and Australia?
If I can take that one, I work closely with the Department for International Trade. I'm going to answer this in quite a vague way. I'm going to point towards DIT. They're leading on the FTA negotiations, and they're consulting with UK business and other stakeholders. So I think I would point you in that direction.
Does anybody else want to add anything on that question?
I'm going to say, Peter, I can't add anything to that. That's Sam here.
Okay, thanks for that, Sam. So, Kaylee, have you got another question for us, please?
I do. There was another comment in the Q&A box about a few mentions of Agri-Tech and the environment as part of the Australian visit. Did this topic come up? And they've highlighted some key phrases like methane, ammonia, global warming.
Yes, the I think on my second slide or third slide, the challenges to Australian agriculture are the same as, I would say, agriculture globally. So emissions, sustainability, environmental, animal welfare, they're all on the horizon. And I think, you know, we spoke to the dairy sector, and they said, you know, some of their issues they have with culling bull calves, you know, they need to resolve that to overcome potential consumer complaint. And then the other side was that they want to promote sustainable and high quality traceable food, because countries like China have had food scares, and again Australia wants to promote that, you know, their food is produced under good conditions, it's high quality, it's traceable, and it's good stuff.
In addition to that, at the EvokeAg conference, there was a big focus on soil health. There's lots of talk of the Australians, how their soil was so old, which I'm not really sure what they mean by old, but they have a big focus on improving their soil health, and also water use and efficiency, irrigation scheduling, soil moisture detection, things like that, which also poses a opportunity for the UK, where irrigation scheduling and soil moisture management are predominantly utilised by specialist sectors like the potato industry, or fresh produce, fruit and veg, where it was much more widely used in Australia. So if there are companies which are more specific to soil moisture detection over there, it's an opportunity to utilise those for UK agriculture, or vice versa. If there are UK companies focusing on soil moisture and things like that, then there's a large market for them in Australia, out with the UK.
Okay, so we've possibly got another 5 minutes of questions. I'm not sure how many we've got left. Sandeep, you're next on the rota. How are we looking? We could probably get one or two more questions in if they're there.
Yeah, I've got one again for Carol. So, Carol, you mentioned Agri-Futures had already begun exploring prediction models for their data. Do you have any more details on that, and what kinds of analytics they used, and in which sectors?
They didn't give us many specific details, actually. They really expressed an interest in further developments in this area. They were particularly talking about, as I say, the mass crop production side of things and looking at prediction models for that area. But I'd be happy to, we could always explore that a little bit further if that was of interest. We could ask the question and come back on this.
Thank you. So I'm going to hope that Chris has got one question, one final one, a really good one to finish off the Q&A session. No pressure, Chris.
Don't know about a good one, but we got one anyway. No, was there any? It's a question around any farms or businesses in Australia that have been looking at alternative protein sources for livestock other than the usual suspects like soya, corn, etc. Did you see anything that was looking at novel protein production? And that might also link in to another question that was come around. Was there any interest demonstrated around circular economy, like using industrial biotech for valorizing farm waste, etc.? Was that was that an interesting area in Australia?
I'm trying to pick my brains. It was mentioned, and certainly in the Evoke Ag, they have the breakout sessions, and they had sessions on fish farming and aquaculture. So there was talk in those of using insect protein for fish farming. I can't recall there was anything, I'd say, different from what we know about in Europe.
Thank you.
And like I say, I would concur with just what Robert said. There were various sessions talking about insect farming, but as far as I can remember, not a lot else.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank the panel for answering those questions. Obviously, Kaylee, Sandeep and Chris for posing them and also answering the other questions in the background. Hopefully you enjoyed today. Found it very informative. What has happened, the encouragement to further partnership, further partnership working with Australia. Hopefully some ideas of how to make some of those contacts. Possibility of money, more certain with Carol and satellite applications. Just leave you there with that final slide of the three KTN colleagues that you can contact if you've got any further questions, and Innovate UK speakers from today who you can contact directly. Just wanted to say thank you very much for listening. It has been recorded. We will make the recording available to you, as we will do the slides. And thank you very much for coming. We're now finished. Goodbye.